A German shepherd found the Marine who rescued her and asked for help. What followed made everyone cry. The blizzard erased the road, the fence line, even the glow of town. Yet something kept knocking. Not fists, not branches, a soft thump at Caleb Holt's door, spaced like code. He unlatched it, and the wind roared in, carrying a German shepherd, ice on her whiskers. One paw lifted like a question. She rose on her hind legs. Once, twice, begging without a sound, eyes bright as coals. Then a bark clipped, shaped like the word now. Caleb grabbed his parka and pack. The dog spun and ran into the whiteout. He followed the staggered trail she carved through drifts, past a fence buried to its posts and pines bending like old men. On the ridge, the storm paused, and he heard it. A tiny yip, hidden under the wind. Then the metallic tremor of wire singing against bark. His light caught a tag fluttering on a loop of cable. Poachers, fresh shepherd, whined and reared again, front paws drumming the air as if she could pull a promise from him. Caleb swept the beam farther and froze. Boot prints crossed the gulch, then vanished where the slope broke away. Something had slid, something had been dragged. He moved fast, blood freckles dotted the crusted snow. A second sound lifted, the smallest cry, choking off as if swallowed by the storm. He dropped to a knee, gloved fingers finding a groove in the drift, the shape of a trapped body, the bitter reek of fear. He looked up at the shepherd. "Take me," he said. "Right now, please." She turned, limped into the black timber, and the white world closed behind them like a door. What happened next will leave you in tears. Where are you watching from? Drop your country in the comment. If you believe in second chances, hit subscribe. Bozeman lay under a white hush that swallowed distance and sound. The Bridger Range rose like a frozen wall, blue with shadow, roofs hunched beneath drifts, and pines wore rime so heavy their boughs brushed buried fences. Plows crawled the highway like beetles, yet the storm kept taking back whatever men cleared. North of town the road narrowed to two ruts, and ended at a cabin braced against wind. Caleb Holt lived there, 44, lean from work, moving with the care of someone who had learned to weigh consequences. A pale scar ran from the corner of his left eye to his cheekbone. Other damage lived deeper, the kind that sent him walking before dawn because motion kept bad reels from playing. Afghanistan had given and taken in equal measure, and left him with a habit of watchfulness. He could not set down. Orders steadied him. Boots lined the mat. A kettle breathed. A map of the Bridgers hung with pencil rotes across ridges and gullies. A paper listed the men from his platoon in 2 columns. Here, gone. He sharpened tools by hand, stacked wood in cords with crossed ends, and spoke little in town, preferring nods at the feed store. Most mornings he slung his rifle, zipped his parka, and walked a loop. He read snow like waves, fox stitches along willow, a moose trench like a dragged log, grouse wing prints, fanning where one had blasted up. Wind carried news too. Branch chatter meant gusts on the ridge. A hush meant a predator near or weather turning. A year earlier a German shepherd had lurched from the trees with a trap clamped to her lower leg, ribs showing through matted fur. Caleb had lowered his rifle, spoken softly, and approached with patience. He slipped a loop of paracord around her shoulders, eased her down and pressed the spring with a fence bar. Steel jaws opened. She trembled, licked his wrist once, and stared with eyes that held a brightness he had not seen in years. He watched her run limping into timber, free and fear. On this evening, wind drove snow sideways across the clearing and hissed under the door. The forecast climbed from advisory to blizzard, though Caleb already knew. Drifts built a new geography on the porch, burying the second step by afternoon and swallowing it by dusk. He locked the shed, checked the generator, added a log, and ran a rag through the rifle's action, because routine steadied him when the storm wanted everything. The first bark sounded thin, half swallowed by the roar. He set his cup down and listened. The second reached him clean. He unlatched the door and the cold rushed his face. She stood 2 steps off the stoop, one paw lifted like a question. Frost silvered her whiskers, and a faint hitch marked the leg that had once known steel. She rose on her hind legs. Once, twice, paws lifted, pleading without a sound. Amber eyes cut through the gust as if they could carry meaning without words. Caleb pulled on his parka, tugged down the wool cap, and swung the pack that always waited by the hook. Inside were tourniquet, gauze, tape, knife, flashlight, space blanket, cord, spare mitts, jerky. He checked the rifle by touch, then stepped into snow up to his shins even on the packed path, and latched the door behind him. They moved into timber where wind weakened enough to let other sounds live. The shepherd set a pace that respected his stride without surrendering urgency. She limped yet covered ground, pausing to look back, ears pricked, muzzle white with frost. Tracks cut by men crossed their route, deep, square, set wide. Cable anchors left bright scars around young aspens near knee-high. Poachers had been working these hills, bold with distance from town and cover from storms. He spoke to the dog the way he would to a jumpy recruit or a shaken child. "I'm with you," he said. She flicked an ear, trotted on, and gave a low whine when the land broke ahead. The gulch opened like a seam in the forest, a dark line where drifts piled deep, and trees went down early. 3 young aspens along the rim showed pale bands where cable had bitten. The shepherd veered toward a tangle where a spruce had toppled and torn a. She barked hard, nose down, tail rigid. Caleb slid to his knees and angled the light into the hollow. A smaller shepherd lay wedged there, about 6 months old, coat thick, breath fast and shallow, a snare cinched above the hock, wire disappearing into crusted snow. Blood freckled the drift and turned black where wind kissed it. The pup tried to lift a head, failed, then looked at him with that same amber, new and fragile in a younger face. Caleb talked while his hands worked. "Okay, I've got you. Stay." He slid the bar under the cam and leaned. Springs groaned and eased. The cable relaxed a fraction. He picked ice from coils with the knife tip, careful and slow. The mother pressed her muzzle to the pup's ear and exhaled a tremble he felt more than her. The wire let go one click at a time until it slipped free, leaving a cruel groove and swelling that would rise before it fell. He cleaned the wound with iodine until fur shone rust and wrapped gauze snug enough to hold, loose enough to spare feel. He cut a strip of foam and taped a boot around the leg with vetwrap. The pup quivered but didn't fight. When he looked up, the mother met his eyes with a charge he could stand in. Gratitude and demand layered together steadied him more than heat. Night pressed from the ridge, dimming the hollow. He needed to move. He sawed spruce limbs, lashed a flat with cord, folded the space blanket, and slid the pup onto the silver cradle. The mother circled once and stood at the nose. "We head home," he said. "Stay close." He rigged the rifle sling as a tow and leaned into the rope. The sled creaked, then moved. They climbed the lip and found wind again, harsher and less forgiving. Snow stung exposed skin. Drifts had doubled since he opened the door. Caleb set a cadence he could hold. Plant, pull, breathe, step. He didn't stare far ahead. He counted small tasks. Check the wrap, check the dog, watch the trees, listen for branches that crack like shots. He marked each success and took the next. Behind the storm, town lights hid in kitchens. Out here every action mattered, because there wasn't a crowd to cover mistake. The shepherd bumped his leg when the sled skidded, and he corrected, both adjusting like partners who had practiced. He had walked years alone because alone felt safe. Now a limping dog had found his door. A smaller life lay in his hands, and the miles between fear and shelter pulled like a vow he meant to keep. If this moved you, let courage guide small choices. Have you ever felt a call to help, even when it's hard? Share in the comments. Snow deepened until each step felt like hauling stone through cold water. Caleb kept the tow rope snug and let the small sled track behind, careful not to jolt the pup under the silver blanket. The German shepherd led with a limp that struck the trail like a metronome. Urgency turned into rhythm. She paused, rose on her hind legs, as if testing scent carried on the wind, then dropped and pressed on with a low whine that meant faster without a word. Pines narrowed into a corridor, their needles glazed with rime and heavy with drift. Gusts stripped powder from branches and flung it in veils that blurred landmarks and buried boot prints. As soon as they formed, the air gnawed through wool and canvas, seeking skin at his wrists and neck. Caleb listened past the roar for other notes. The dry clack of twigs, the wire singer whine of tension on bark, the hollow drum of ice shifting in the gulch below. He angled his light low so glare would not blind him, and kept his rifle high on his shoulder. Boot prints crossed the path where cover thinned, deep, wide, recent. Edges stood crisp, not slump-shouldered by weather. He knelt, set 2 fingers in a tread, and measured width by habit. Cheap rubber, rough chevron, worn on the outside. Not a rancher's leather, not a skier's narrow track. Another print overlapped the first, lighter, right foot dragging a touch. 2 men, one heavy, one stiff in the knee or careless. They worked this slope without fear of being seen. The shepherd bumped his arm and gave a breathy bark. He rose, adjusted the sling, and followed her through young aspens that rang in the gusts like chimes. Pale scars circled a dozen trunks where cable had chewed bark, bright rings that glared even in storm light. Anger rose and he caged it. Heat wastes air, air keeps you moving. Snow talked underfoot, squeak where crust thickened, hush where drifts lay new, crisp crack where a layer broke. Branches snapped and fell with sounds too much like trouble. His muscles answered those noises before thought. The old dance of react, evaluate, move. Afghanistan lived near the surface on nights like this. Reeds along canals rattling like coins, alleys that held quiet too long. A boy smiling a little too fast before the street opened under a wheel. He pushed those reels aside by counting steps and clearing angles with his eyes the way a man eases into a doorway. The dog kept glancing back, amber eyes bright even in gray, and each look hauled him out of memory and into now. They crested a low swell and the land fell away ahead, a white slide toward a darker band where the gulch lay frozen. The wind changed tone, lower, meaner, like breath pulled through teeth. The shepherd rose again, front paws lifted, chest open, a silent appeal that reached farther than any shouted order. He answered with a nod and a hand on her shoulder. I'm here. Keep going. He could have turned back on the ridge. He had cut the snare and wrapped the He had put life on a sled and pointed it toward shelter. Duty argues that enough is enough. Yet those eyes held a steady flame that made quitting taste like sand. Trust is a weight a man either carries or drops. He had dropped it once and mailed a letter that still lives in his nightstand. He would not repeat that lesson. The slope steepened. He cut steps with his heels, tested each patch with the staff, then lowered his weight carefully so the crust would hold. The sled hissed, then rested as he set the line across his chest. The shepherd matched his pace, stopping when he stopped, listening to the gulch as if it had a voice. She could translate. Twice she froze, head high, then angled left to avoid hollows that looked safe and were not. He followed her track because instincts that save one life can save 3. A gust shoved him sideways and peeled a slab of drift off the slope. It slid slow, then fast, hissing as it carried twigs and a small birch over the lip. He waited for the slam. None came. The dark band swallowed the sound whole. He tasted metal, breathed through his nose until the flavor faded, then checked the sled, the wrap, the dog. All right, keep moving. The gulch's edge formed a shelf walled by bent willow. Snow piled into a cove there, smooth as poured plaster. The shepherd plunged in and dug, throwing powder with frantic efficiency. Caleb braced the sled on a ledge, cut a path with his forearms and found a coil he had loosened earlier, and a second loop sprung tight around nothing. Wire ends glinted where cutters had chewed them. Men had worked here after the storm began. He swept his light along the base and caught a numbered tag on tape, then a candy wrapper pasted to ice, bright red under frost. Careless or cocky, he picked both and slid them into a pocket. The shepherd pressed her head against his knee, held it there and trembled once. He steadied her with a palm and felt his own breath slow. Fear shared becomes a plan. Rock showed through the far wall in black plates, where wind had shaved it clean. A narrow tongue of frozen mud crossed to a bench under thicker timber. New prints went that way and back again, smeared where a heel slipped, messy where a toe caught. The men had crossed several times, checking sets, moving lines, working method without hurry. He pictured how they would carry a catch ropes over shoulders, heads down against weather, hands red from cold and work. He scanned the bench for movement. No color broke the palette of pine, snow, stone. He listened beyond the storm's constant voice, and found the high whine of tension near his ear. Another snare lay tight to a young aspen, loop closed and angry at nothing. He cut it, coiled the wire and slid it under his belt, a small theft that felt like worship in reverse. Above them, a pine shed a limb. It snapped like a rifle and speared into powder, throwing a white cloud that fell back without a sound. Caleb did not stare at the limb. He forced his eyes to the tree line because in another life danger rarely lived where the noise pointed. He counted, scanned, counted again. No movement, only the long slide of wind across needles and the thud of his own heart. The trail narrowed to a throat that would let only one pass at a time. He shortened the rope, tied it twice around his waist, and tested the tongue with his staff. Ice shone blue like glass laid over stone. He took small flat steps, boot soles placed without twist. The sled followed, runners whispering, the tow line humming. The shepherd slid, checked and found purchase with claws in frozen rut. Halfway across, a dump of spindrift fell from a bough and smothered his boots. He pushed on into dark. Snow poured in white sheets that erased edges and stole depth. The German shepherd drove into it with a limp and a purpose that did not waver. Caleb kept the sled behind him, rope across his hips, breath steady, eyes hunting for breaks in the crust. The gulch gathered the storm and held it like a drum, every gust beating cold against his cheeks. Awareness rose until each sound mattered. The dog stopped and rose on her hind legs, paws tight to her chest, begging the wind to give back a scent. She dropped, angled right, and slipped between two bowed aspens that wore bright scars where Cable had bitten bark. A thread of red showed in the drift ahead, not clothing and not berry, only blood on snow. Caleb quickened and dropped to his knees beside a low spruce, where the crown had torn free and sprawled like a broken roof. The pup lay under the fallen limbs, wedged in a pocket the wind could not reach. 6 months old by size and bone, soft around the muzzle, coat clotted where a snare had cut above the hock. The loop sat deep. Swelling had climbed. Blood freckled the drift and glazed into dark beads. The breathing came in small pushes that tried to be brave and did not know how. The eyes were the mother's eyes, only new and unsure, fixed on him as if he might answer a plea. Caleb cleared branches with careful sweeps. Easy, I'm here. Hold still. He slid his staff under the coil to take strain and found the cam half buried in ice. The knot had frozen hard. He pecked the crust with a knife tip, so metal would not slip, and cut deeper. The mother pressed close, shoulder firm to his sleeve, breath shaking through wool. He had worked men from wreckage. He had pulled wire from meat. The body remembers what to do when time narrows. The snare groaned when he leaned the bar. The loop gave a thumb's width. 2 fingers slid beneath, feeling heat and torn hair and the slick of blood thinned by cold. He eased the wire back until he could lift it over the swollen joint. The pup kicked once, then stilled, eyes wide, trusting without reason. Good, he murmured. The loop came free and fell into his palm like a dead snake. Flesh wore a ridged groove. He set his jaw against the sight, not the pain. Pain meant life was still at work. Wind shook powder from the limbs and curtained the hollow. Caleb pulled the space blanket close and let a minute pass while constriction bled out. He cleaned the cut with iodine, watching orange melt through black hair. Gauze went into the groove, then wrap snug and not strangling. The pup's breathing slowed. He set a foam pad and taped a boot, tiny claws tapping his wrist in an involuntary plea that felt like thanks. The mother touched his knuckles with her nose and held there a heartbeat. Boot steps crunched behind him. He turned his head, hands steady. A figure edged down the bank, careful with placement, posture balanced like someone trained not to fall where eyes could see. Olive parka, forest patch, carbine slung muzzle down. The woman pulled back her hood and let snow sting her cheekbones. Dark hair braided tight, eyes quick taking inventory before speech. Rachel Kane, she said, voice clear over the wind. Gallatin Ranger, you're Caleb Holt. He gave a short nod. Pups out of a snare. Bad cut, decent perfusion. He went back to the wrap as she slid closer, angled to keep the hill at her back. She swept her look over cable scars, and sprung anchors and exhaled through her teeth. They've been running lines since early fall, she said. Boulder each week. Tag tape on every third set like flags at a fair. Snow gives them cover, and keeps us boxed in. She squatted and lifted a limb off his shoulder with an easy strength. Mother has an old scar on the lower right. You freed her last winter. Caleb secured the boot and tested the toe. She found my door and brought me out. Rachel watched the mother's thin endurance, the straightness with which she stood, despite the limp. She knew who would come. She pointed with her chin. 2 men today, maybe 3. One favors his right leg. One drags the heel. They brought a drag bag. Light is short. She pulled a roll from her parka. Elastic. Save your vet trap for the cabin. He fixed a second layer. The pup steadied. Breath deeper now. Eyes half closed as shock eased. He checked gums. Pinking. He slid the youngster onto the folded blanket and lashed a small cradle from spruce wands, so the ride would not flex. The mother stepped to the sled and held the nose like a sentry. Caleb's mouth softened. You'll lead. Stay close. Rachel keyed her radio. Static swallowed the first words. Then the channel opened in broken pulses. Bass came, she said. Active line in the north gulch under the lower bench. Juvenile canids snared. Stabilized. Multiple fresh boot prints. West to Timber Road and back. Weather trending whiteout. Moving to safe structure with civilian Holt. Will mark sets where able. The reply tore and vanished. She clipped the unit back and gave Caleb's rig a fast, professional once-over. Good field work. We'll need statements if we land charges. For now we keep them alive. Caleb took the tow and rose into the pull. The sled flexed, then slid with a quiet squeal. The pup made a small sound and settled. The shepherd trotted at his knee, head high, ears working like sail. Rachel took rear guard, watching the ridge and the timber throat. Boots set to blur their marks where she could, without losing speed. Snow thickened in slanted lines that turned the trees to smudges. The air tasted of iron and pressure, cold pulling at his teeth. They climbed the first pitch with feet set flat, so the crust would hold. Caleb worked by measure, not bravado. 3 breaths, 10 steps, check the load, listen, move. A limb cracked high and fell with a tearing rush that made the mother flinch, and then square herself. Stubborn as a vow, Rachel's hand thumped his shoulder in warning, just before a slab slid off the bank and hissed past the sled. He shifted weight, kept the nose pointed, and let it pass. At the bend she touched his arm, and pointed at a bright scrap under a willow arch. He knelt and peeled up a ribbon of tape. Numbers bled from smear and refreeze. They're mocking us, she said. Markers so they can run the line blind. I want to strip them, but I also want a map for a warrant. Photograph, then pocket, he said. She clicked a small camera and recorded the find with cold finger. He slid the tape beside a candy wrapper he had taken earlier, each piece a tooth on a gear that might someday turn. The gulch narrowed, and the wind found a throat. It sang in a high metallic register that made talk feel wasteful. They moved without words, because talk bled heat and attention. The pup shifted and licked the back of Caleb's glove, where it rested near the rail. He pressed a knuckle against the small tongue and felt the slightest answer. Gratitude brave and small. The grade eased near a buried service road. Snow had filled the ditches level, turning the slope into a false floor. Rachel went first, probing with a staff until she found the old crown. Here, she said. 2 feet of fluff over glare. She set crampons and crossed, leaving steps he could place without thought. He followed her marks, kept the sled square, and breathed through the burn gathering in his legs. On the far side, the timber stood tighter and spared them the worst of the gusts. Needles held snow in pale fans. Trunks wore collars of rime. The world glowed with a dim milk light that made distance tricky. Caleb let the rhythm of work cut memory down to size. He matched the mother's cadence and kept it, step by step, because minutes make miles when a life rides your rope. Rachel drew level again. You still run dawn loops on the East Ridge, she said. I see your tracks. Habit, he said. A way to sleep. She nodded once. You saved men overseas, she said. You are saving this one here. Her gaze flicked to the cradle. Courts care about proof. The land cares about action. Orange glow showed through the white ahead. The stubborn throw of his porch light fighting weather. Relief sharpened his focus. Almost there, he told the mother. She lifted on her hind legs and set her paws against his coat for a breath, as if blessing the promise, then dropped and forged ahead. They reached the bend, where the trees opened, and the slope eased toward his clear. The wind pressed their backs as if trying to turn them around, but the dog held the line and Caleb matched her, every step placed with care. Snow squealed under the runners. The pup breathed, with small steady effort, the sound thin and stubborn. Rachel scanned the timber behind, then lifted a hand to quicken the last stretch, not rushing, refusing panic, guiding them with a practiced calm he could respect. At the edge of the clearing the storm swirled like smoke. The porch light burned a small faithful circle in the hay. Caleb took the last rise, backed the sled over the threshold, and closed the door. The roar cut off, replaced by the low, even voice of the stove and the ticking of heat at the flue. He eased the pup onto folded towels, checked the wrap, and added clean gauze where melt had loosened the first layer. The mother lay with her flank against the small body and watched every breath, eyes bright, ears pricked, ready to rise if the world asked more of her. Rachel stamped snow from her boots and stood near the fire without stealing heat. She took in the map, the neat cords of wood, the order that steadied a crowded mind. You keep a harbor, she said. We'll need it. Lines this bold mean men who do not fear face. I'll run a case with tags and prints when weather lets us reach them. Tonight you did what matters. The room held quiet. Have you ever saved something precious? Tell us below. Snow sealed the gulch like a lid, wind grinding white across the rim, and pressing sound flat. Under the fallen spruce, Caleb knelt by the pup while Rachel lifted branches. The mother stood close, eyes fixed, breath steaming. Blood freckled the crust. A loop sat deep above the hock, tag ticking against bark. Easy, he said, voice steady from use, not calm. He wedged his staff under the cam, chipped ice with careful taps, then leaned until steel sighed. The loop gave a finger's width. He slid fingers beneath, felt heat, and eased the wire over swollen bone. The pup jerked, then fixed him with pleading amber. Rachel pressed elastic into his palm and angled her body to block spindrift. 2 more sets above us, she said. Tag tape on both. They're bold. The wire fell to the snow with a soft ring. Caleb set it aside like a dead snake. He rinsed the groove with iodine, patted it with gauze and foam, and wrapped it snug but gentle. He checked perfusion, found pink return and slid a small boot over the dressing, sealing it with tidy bands. The pup's breathing steadied. The mother exhaled against his wrist, and something inside him steadied. A glint winked on the rim when the wind thinned the veil. Another snare hung from a young aspen, tag clicking against chewed bark. More loops lay half buried above. Heat rose under his collar. He folded it into the next task, because anger unguided makes clumsy hands. He cut spruce wands, notched ends, and bound them with tight cordage. Cross pieces braced the rails. He spread the space blanket tight and tucked corners so the wind could not peel them. The sled looked simple and tough. He lifted the pup onto Silver, tucked the blanket, and felt a tiny lick on his glove. The mother pressed her jaw to the rail, then looked up. He read what she had already chosen. This team would reach heat and light, whatever wire and weather demanded. Up on 3, Rachel said, taking the rear brace. They slid the sled clear. Caleb looped the tow line around his waist, twice, tied a half hitch, and felt the rope settle across muscle he trusted. The mother took point, limping yet sure, shoulders square, head high. Snow hissed through spruce needles. He looked once at the nearest loop. The tag flicked like a dare. Farther up, small gleams marked more. The flare sharpened into a thought. I will return. They moved. Runners sang a thin note. Wind gnawed the gap where scarf met cheek. Caleb walked by measures that kept panic out. 10 steps. Breathe. Check. Scan left and right. Rachel ranged like a shadow. Sometimes lid, sometimes rear. Words wasted air. Practice saved it. At a choke of blue ice, he set his boots flat, staff testing for tooth. The sled hummed and followed. The mother moved above the line, turning her head to check the bundle. Guardianship looks like that. Watch, adjust, endure. Cracks sounded as loaded branches failed. Old reels tried to roll in Caleb's mind, but he canceled them by giving the present a voice. Left edge, hold, step. The words were not for anyone else. They kept thought from sliding where it could not help. The throat opened to a bench where fur broke the blow. Air gentled. Smell returned. Wet bark, iron, faint sap. Rachel touched his sleeve and pointed back. County line's a mile, she said. Their sets, step over it like laws don't exist. They'll learn otherwise, he said. Only truth he intended to make real. They climbed toward a buried service road. The plows would find when the sky cleared. Snow filled the ditches level. Rachel probed with a staff and found the crown. Here, she said. Hard under soft. She crossed, then waved him. He followed her marks, kept the sled square, and felt the rope sing across his hips. A gust dumped spindrift from a fur that smothered his boots and blinded him white. He paused, counted 3, let fear pass, then moved. On the far side he knelt, checked the dressing, and tightened the blanket. Warmth lived under gauze. The pup blinked and sighed. The mother leaned her head into his cheek for one long second. Contact relit a corner he had boarded up. They pushed into thicker timber. Light dwindled to milk. Tracks curled behind and vanished. As the next veil fell, Caleb let the simple pattern carry him forward. Plant, pull, breathe, listen. Within that rhythm a decision hard. He would map the line, photograph tags, strip loops, pack evidence, call the case, and if the system stalled, keep the hills clean with his own hands. The grade eased near the ridge that divides the gulch from his clearing. Past it waited warmth, clean water, steady light. He tasted copper and the honest burn of work that mattered more than sleep. The mother steadied the sled at his knee. Rachel dropped behind and erased scuffs that might tell tracking eyes too much. Teamwork braided into a strong cord. At the crest he looked back. Their route stitched white from pit to ridge. His heavy prints, the mother's limp, the runner lines. Upslope, a sparse constellation of glints, marked snares not yet touched. Snow was already trying to erase every mark. The old ache of helplessness pressed and found a promise blocking the door. He spoke it aloud, voice carried a little by the gale, meant for wire, pine, rock, and the small beating life on silver. I'll be back for every trap, he said. Every one. Rachel heard, and nodded, breath smoking, eyes bright with agreement. Dawn, if the sky gives us a window, she said, we document then cut. The mother stepped close, shoulder pushing his thigh, sealing the covenant with weight. He laid his palm on her head, and felt trust come through bone, a current that steadied his hands. The sled creaked once. The pup blew a tiny frost bubble and slept on, alive because people and the dog refused to leave a cruel thing standing. They took the last slope in silence, breaths rough, steps exact. The blizzard roared, and then seemed to pull back, as if the night respected a vow. Blood on snow, bandage secure, guardians near. Newer Bayans near, those were the facts. Paperwork in the hunt would follow, but hope had teeth tonight, and it held. He counted 4 more tags winking under drift within 30 paces, each a small cruelty waiting for another neck or leg. The sight hit, then hardened into focus. He pictured daylight, boots biting, cutters on wire, coils stacking in a sack, coordinates on a map, photos clipped to a report with names and date. Beside him Rachel read the same ledger, and gave a short nod that closed an unspoken brief. This would be more than rescue. It would be return, removal, and proof. The mother pressed closer, chest against his knee, eyes unwavering. He answered by touching her head and saying the only oath that fit the night. I'm coming back, he said, for every snare. Hope felt real enough to lift the rope. The blizzard thickened until the world narrowed to breath, rope, and the thin hum of runners over crust. Caleb leaned into the tow, hips taking the pull, shoulders square so the sled would not yaw. Beneath the silver blanket the pup whimpered, small sounds stubborn and alive, then settled when the glide turned smooth again. The German shepherd paced at his flank, head high, ears working like small sails, glancing at the bundle after every dozen steps, as if counting breaths with him. Rachel moved on the windward side, reading the slope the way water reads a channel. She tested a buried crown with her staff, and called a warning before blue ice flashed. "Hard layer, 2 steps wide, then powder," she said, voice clean even when gusts chewed the edges of words. She waited for the sled to cross, and then scrubbed scuffs with her boot, a habit born of years keeping paths safe for creatures that never meant to meet danger until it bit. They slipped into fur where the blow softened, snow held to boughs like folded wings. Caleb counted 10 breaths, then checked the wrap, easing the blanket around a paw that had kicked free. A warm tongue touched his glove and withdrew. The mother hovered and pressed her shoulder to the rail, a living brace that steadied him more than the stove he imagined ahead. Trust like that asks a man to match it. His hands answered with care, he could feel in his bones. Between pulls, Rachel spoke in spare lines spaced by breath rather than hurry. She told of a moose calf hauled from a thaw-swollen creek, legs cut by wire set too low for any mercy. They lifted it on a door taken from a shed while the cow waited in the willows and chuffed through fear. She told of a bald eagle grounded by fishing line buried in a wing, harm born of neglect more than malice, and how slow hands and time returned the bird to sky. Wind hissed through needles while she spoke, and the stories ran through Caleb's own. He had carried wounded men through alleys that smelled of dust and diesel, had pried a door off hinges to make a litter, had felt breath slow against his ribs and willed it to keep going. Those memories carried weight. They had also left an emptiness he refused to name. Out here that weight served a purpose again. Yard by yard, the hollow space filled with something quiet and bright that did not vanish when he blinked. They reached a bench where drifts made a white table that looked firm and swallowed his boot to mid-shin. He widened his stance, set flat feet so the crust would not shear, and worked the rope with small adjustments that spared the wound. The sled hissed and listed. The mother nudged it true. Rachel ranged ahead and probed, marking a safe ribbon between weak spots. She did not dramatize risk. She managed it with craft, and the example steadied his mind more than talk ever could. He spoke first this time, keeping voice low to save heat. "You work these lines alone." She shook her head. "Rotations, volunteers, federal help when paperwork wakes. Weather breaks us apart more than policy. I go where sign is freshest." She tipped her chin toward the bundle. "Tonight I followed tracks that stopped at your porch. Smart partner." The mother glanced back as if praise could be stored like fuel, then turned to face the gale and took the lead again. A gust dropped a white curtain that erased the way they had come. The world shrank to a moving circle, edges frayed, center inside that circle, teamwork hardened into habit. Caleb watched for tree wells, wind slabs and the dark hint of water under ice. Rachel swept for hazards like a fuse runner, quick and exact. The shepherd stayed between sled and wind, taking the sting that would have stolen heat from the small body they guarded. When breath allowed, Rachel shared the reasons she stayed in these hills. A teacher in Livingston had shown her how elk move when storms come, and how fences writhe in wind and catch lives that never meant to tangle. An uncle had taught tracks after a flood scours, silt fans, crushed reeds, reading a river like a legend. "Justice matters," she said, "but the land teaches a deeper lesson. Repair rarely looks grand. It looks like steady work that leaves rooms warmer, water cleaner, trails open, and nests whole." Something old loosened in Caleb. The rope cut across his jacket and bit into muscle, willing to work again for a reason that did not blur. Snow squealed under runners and sanded thoughts smooth. He pictured a map with pins, tags bagged and logged, loops piled in a bin, photos clipped to a file that would lead to a doorbell at dawn. He pictured dawn itself, pink on the bridgers, steam above roofs, smoke laid flat by cold air. For years he had watched mornings without caring. Now he wanted to meet one. They angled toward a swale, where saplings grew thick. Rachel halted and pointed at a dent that looked ordinary. "Moose pit," she said. "Post hole central." She detoured across the crown of a buried ditch that carries spring melt. Caleb followed, lightening the sled with a lift on the rope. The mother threaded the new path without question, checking the cradle with quick turns of her head. Guardianship needs no lecture. It proves itself through attention, distance held, time stretched, not as torment but as duty measured in footsteps. Caleb's mind drifted to the sheet of names back at the cabin, 2 columns he had never learned how to join. He had lived too long with the idea that a man must choose one side forever. Under driving snow, with a dog nudging his knee and a ranger watching the rear, that idea felt as fragile as hoarfrost before a flame. They crested a hump. The sky lightened a shade, as if the storm had emptied its lungs. Far downslope a faint orange smudge trembled. Porch light. Home. He almost laughed, not from relief alone, but from the clarity of aim between this breath and that door. The pup whimpered and fell quiet, the sound tiny, resilient, alive. The mother brushed the rail, and then his leg, a wordless thank you that felt like a hand closing around his and asking him to keep going. Rachel's voice softened. People drop cookies when we return They don't see nights like this. I don't need cookies. I need eyes across fences and a promise. Those loops won't go back up. I can be eyes, he said. She nodded once, and the pledge settled with the same certainty as the rope across his hip. They took the last pitch as a long traverse that spared the weakest ankle. Wind stiffened, then softened. Trees opened. The clearing waited with drifted steps and one stubborn light. Caleb eased the sled over the threshold, swung the door and let warmth swallow the roar. Steam lifted from coats and gloves. The pup blinked in the change, sneezed, and tucked its nose against the blanket with a small sigh that pressed against his ribs. He laid the little body near the stove, refreshed the wrap, and set a bowl with water warmed to the inside of a rib. The mother curled close, flank touching flank, nose at the edge of the blanket. Rachel hung wet gear and fed the fire with practiced hands, then turned with a look that asked nothing, and promised plenty. In that plain room, the long hunger that had kept him apart, purpose sat down and stayed, not loud, not grand, but strong enough to carry through another storm. Rachel wrote coordinates in a small notebook and tucked it away. We have a line to map and cut, she said. Weather will give us a window, and we will take. I'll be there, he answered. The mother lifted her head, as if approving the plan, and lowered it again to guard the pup while heat soaked into bandage and bone. Outside, the wind pawed the corners, but the walls held, and the night finally felt like it belonged to life rather than fear. Fire glowed behind the stove glass. A quiet orange lake. Heat seeped into cedar. Thawing air that had bitten all night. The pup lay in a nest of towels, legs twitching as if practicing running again. Each breath rose, paused and settled with growing ease. The mother curled along that small body, nose near the bandage, ears shifting at every cabin, whisper, unwilling to sleep deeply while danger might still knock. Caleb checked the wrap, wiping a faint bloom of seepage. Iodine stained the fur beneath clean gauze. He loosened the boot a fraction to spare swelling, smoothed the blanket, and rested his palm on tiny ribs until the rhythm steadied under his hand. Rachel stood with warm water, cotton, and neat strips on a tray, passing each piece the moment he needed it, matching his cadence like a partner who had worked storms before. Pulse is stronger, she said, voice lowered, as if gentleness itself could help. Caleb nodded, answering more with care than words. Memory waited with sharp teeth. Tonight the room poured light into its corners, and those teeth felt blunt. He cleaned clotted hair, watched the pup stir, and felt a door somewhere inside unbar. The wind shouldered the cabin only in short pushes now. When gusts came, snow slid from the roof in soft slabs. Then silence returned, humming with stove breath, dog breath, and human breath. 3 tempos touching until they sounded like one song. Rachel tipped her chin toward the map by the table. You kept lines even when you didn't need them, she said. Pencil routes crossed ridges, noted springs, and marked winter range. He had tried to live beside those marks, not under them. Firelight painted the edges of everything, and grief stepped back enough to leave room for another weight. He sat on the floor so he shared the wounded level. The mother opened one eye, then closed it slowly with trust so complete it felt like blessing. The stove flicked blue at its base and settled again into orange. Caleb watched that pulse until his breathing matched the glow. I used to think stillness meant danger, he said, surprised he had chosen speech. Then danger ended, and stillness kept feeling the same. Rachel crouched, cuffs damp, braid haloed by steam. Bodies keep old orders when nobody countersigns, she said. New orders stick after proof arrives. She nodded toward the pup. That proof has 4 feet. The youngster blinked and lifted its head an inch, nose sampling air warmed by cedar and broth. Rachel slid a shallow bowl forward. Caleb steadied it while the pink tongue touched water. The first swallow looked like work, the second like learning, the third like joy in a small, tired coat. The mother licked one ear. Anointing effort. Caleb smiled without planning to. An awkward crease that felt like a field returning to grass after machines retire. They changed the top layer of gauze. Clean white wrapped over calmer skin, trading fierce urgency for slow care inside walls that held. Hands that had kept people alive among concrete and fire, learned again how to move without bracing for blast. He noticed the room inside his chest was bigger than he had allowed. Loss remained, but trust set a chair there, and waited without demand. Rachel wrote times in a notebook, and left margin space for notes that might arrive with dawn. After rest, a very short walk outdoors, she said. A dozen steps, careful set, then back to heat. Small sips often. If swelling climbs past the first wrap, we loose. Instructions felt like rope that fit his hands. The kind tied so often no knot slips when fingers grow cold. He cracked the door. Cold entered like a polite guest finally invited. The storm had lost its voice, leaving flakes that fell straight as prayer when wind loses the argument. Spruce tips wore white caps. Sky shifted from black to washed gray, holding color like a secret almost ready to share. Caleb stepped onto the porch, drew air through his teeth, and scanned the tree line by habit. No movement showed, except a raven lifting from a snag, wings scissoring as it chose a route into quiet places. He closed the door, and warmth felt larger for the contrast. The mother had not moved. The pup slept again, dreaming a good dream now. Paws flicking to a rhythm that belonged to running and not fear. They drank broth in easy silence, and ate stew that tasted better because the day had not been easy. A scrap fell. The mother did not take it until Caleb offered from an open hand. Even hunger deferred to trust's rules. He let memories come without judgment. Names from the sheet appeared, not as verdicts, but as faces that had laughed under bad skies and counted breaths, the way he had counted steps on the ridge. He had served their absence by making his life small. A pup's breath and a mother's gaze asked him to serve by enlarging it instead. Tomorrow, Rachel said, weather gives a window. We'll walk the line from the bench to the service road, and then the willows. We'll record every tag and coil. Every county can meet us at the gate, by noon if plows keep up. Caleb pictured the route as if it had already happened. Cutters in his pocket, bags for evidence, a camera secure, coordinates penciled clear. He heard the snick of wire, the cry of a loop leaving bark, the hollow landing of coils in a sack. The fire eased to coals, and settled into patient red. He added one split, then another, building heat the way you build anything worth keeping. Layer, pause, check, adjust. The mother lifted her head and watched each motion like ceremony. He touched her brow. She leaned into his palm, weight trustful, breath warm, eyes bright with gratitude he felt rather than saw. Outside, darkness thick. Color rose, hesitant at first, then sure pale rose along the eastern shoulder of the Bridgers, spreading across frosted roofs and the white field beyond the porch. The storm's last tatters drifted like wool pulled from a thorn. Caleb stood in the doorway and let that dawn find him. It did. Clean as creek water in thaw, honest as a promise spoken without witnesses. Behind him the pup shifted and pressed closer to heat. Rachel gathered the tray and said she would call base at first light. Voice still soft because softness fit. The mother sighed, a long release like a gate opening. Caleb matched pace and felt the old drum inside his chest adopt a kinder beat that did not erase what came before, only made room for what followed. He studied his hands, scarred yet steady, and understood they could build days rather than merely hold nights. The pink sky deepened, snow clicked faintly as it settled, fire comforted without boasting. Every piece of the scene asked for care and offered it back. He knelt once more, palm over small ribs, counted 8 slow rises, 8 gentle falls, then stood with clear eyes. Morning unspooled softly, as if the storm had been a long-held breath. Finally released, light slid across the cabin floor, in pale ribbons, brightening boot leather, map edges, and the small silver cradle near the stove. Heat washed the room. The pup stirred, stretched, and lifted its head. A tremor ran down the narrow spine, then steadied. The mother rose before anyone else moved, set her muzzle against the youngster's cheek, and waited while sleepy eyes learned the new day. Caleb crouched and eased the blanket aside. Fresh gauze sat clean. Swelling had settled into a manageable ridge. He tested capillary return with a careful thumb and watched pink rise like dawn through snow. Good, he said, surprised by how natural that word felt in his mouth. The pup shifted again, lifted the wrapped leg an inch, and placed weight through the other 3. A determined sound followed. Not pain, not fear, ambition testing limits. Rachel stood near the window, fastening her radio to a fresh battery. Her breath fogged the cold pain. Beyond the glass, the world looked reborn, furs jeweled with frost, drifts, scalloped and unbroken, except for last night's stitched trail, sky washed clean to a gentle blue. "We have a window," she said, listening to sparse chatter on the channel. "County is digging toward the gate. I'll file coordinates at noon." The mother nudged the pup's ear. A pink tongue answered with clumsy gratitude. Caleb slid a palm beneath the chest and helped until balance arrived. Wobble turned to stance. The youngster stood, back leg set wide, the wrapped limb held forward, head tilted listening to its own courage. The mother stepped back half a pace, eyes bright, tail low and steady, pride tempered by vigilance. "Let's give you the day," Caleb murmured. He set the tiny boot down so the soul-kissed towel, then lifted the bowl. Warm water shimmered in the firelight. The pup sniffed, lapped, then looked toward the door. Outside, sunlight made the snow sparkle like ground glass, while a raven cut a clean line toward the ridge. They tried the threshold first. Rachel opened the door, a hand's width to let the air speak. It came gentle, edged with cedar and smoke. The mother glanced at Caleb, then at her child, then back again, seeking permission only to make everyone part of the choice. He wrapped a scarf around the pup's neck for warmth and lifted. "Short," he said, and sweet. He stepped onto the porch. Boards creaked. A breeze lifted edges of fur and carried faint scents. Pine sap, spent storm, distant stove. The pup's paws touched sunlit planks. Weight shifted. The youngster set the good hind foot, tested the wrapped leg, and allowed it to carry a careful slice of burden. The mother slid alongside, chest nearly touching, offering balance without stealing agency. Together they reached the top step. Snow waited, glazed with a shine that turned each crystal into a tiny mirror. Caleb carried the cradle down and set it on the first drift to offer choice. The pup leaned forward, sniffed, and stepped with precise, tentative care, placing the wrapped limb lightly, then trusting it enough for a second step. Balance wavered, recovered, and held while breath puffed tiny clouds that drifted like feathers. Sound felt new. Snow squeaked lightly. Wind threaded branches with a whisper that sounded like old promises kept. Caleb followed with hands ready but loose, learning to give support without smothering. Rachel stayed back, letting the family shape their rhythm. She scanned the timber line and smiled at the set of the youngster's ears. The proud carriage, the quick lesson in joy. They crossed a patch of shallow glitter where night had laid hoarfrost and lake. The pup paused to study that sparkle, then reached out and tasted a flake with the gravity of someone meeting snow for the first time since pain. The mother nudged playfully. A tiny hop answered, clumsy and perfect. Caleb laughed, not loud, not forced, just a sound that had missed him for years. Returning to its old seat, he drew a breath big enough to carry new vows. The paper with names would keep its place, yet today asked that he write a different list. Loops cut, lines mapped, sets removed, evidence logged, promises kept. Purpose arrived not as thunder but as a quiet weight a person can carry all day without noticing the strain. He felt taller for it. He felt useful, The ridge no longer looked like a border between hard nights and harder mornings. It looked like a work site waiting for hands. Rachel came off the porch and touched his sleeve. "They'll come back," she said, nodding at the pair. "This valley remembers safe door." He watched the mother lift on her hind legs, pause briefly off snow. A bit of yesterday's pleading transformed into thanks. He set his palm to her head and held it there while the pup leaned against his boot and claimed him with a sigh. They walked a small circle, just enough to bring warmth through muscle and tell bone the storm had ended. The youngster's tail attempted a wag, and then found the right rhythm. The mother shadowed, proud and alert. Sun climbed. The porch light looked foolish against that brightness, and shut off with a tiny click that sounded like consent. Back inside, the cabin felt larger. Steam rose from mugs. The pup settled, exhausted and victorious. Nose on paws, eyes sliding closed. The mother stretched long and rested her chin on Caleb's shoe, a silent appointment for future work. Rachel called base and sent coordinates. Voice clipped. Sure, relief. She stowed the radio and drew a simple plan on the map. Arrows along the willows, circles where tags had flashed, an X near the pit that had tried to swallow them. After lunch, she said, "We'll mark everything we can reach. You'll keep the fire and watch our patient between pass." Caleb nodded. Routine, once a wall against grief, now framed a doorway. He would split wood, boil water, monitor swelling, and be ready with cutters when the line called. Outside, a jay scolded. Powder slid from a low bough and thumped softly. Clouds drifted like slow ships across a bright sea. The world had reset in the oldest way, not with an announcement, with light falling on small truths that had waited under snow. Kindness changed the course of a morning, and then the shape of the day, and then what a man believed about tomorrow. In that recognition he found room for gratitude, that felt steady rather than fragile, the sort that stays when storms return. Caleb looked at the pair and understood he had been rescued too, not from weather or wire, but from a winter that had lasted longer than any fork. The mother opened one eye as if she heard the thought. The pup snored faintly, all struggle for now replaced by healing sleep. He felt the cabin become a harbor, and the hills a calling again, a wide promise stretching from door to ridge with bright certainty. 3 weeks after the blizzard, the valley opened like a hymn. Daylight poured between the bridgers and the tobacco roots, turning the snowfields to a slow river of light. Caleb had split a final rack of spruce and stacked kindling in clean, squared cords when a sound lifted from the timber, a bark he already knew, confident and bright, followed by the patter of 4 quick feet and a heavier, settled stride. He set the maul aside and stepped into the yard. Breath steamed as the pair cleared the last line of spruce. They ran a sweeping arc and barreled into him, snow flying like feathers beaten from a pillow. The youngster planted both forepaws on his thighs and laughed the way only dogs can, every muscle singing yes. The mother pressed her shoulder to his knees, then rose briefly on her hind legs, not pleading anymore, greeting, a ceremony remade for calmer days. "Look at you," he said, rubbing the new heft in the younger chest. The boot was gone. The scar showed as a pale ring under darker fur, a reminder without threat. Rachel pulled her truck into the plowed turnoff. A few minutes later, tires cracking through a glaze. She waved a clipboard and grinned. 2 more lines mapped above the willows. "County's ready to serve warrants when we deliver prints and tags. You hosting a reunion?" The pup answered by running joyful ellipses, kicking up powder while the mother watched with the quiet pride of someone who remembers wire and honors grace. Inside the cabin the fire murmured. The dogs circled and collapsed with the right to belong. The youngster stretched long. The mother tucked against Caleb's boots. He set water to warm and ladled stew. Rachel spread maps on the table. Pins dotted the gulch and the timber road. Small red lights tracking harm turned into evidence. Coils of cut cable lay in burlap sacks by the door like snakes turned to iron sleep. They planned the next passes in quiet, working as if the hills listened. Caleb would take the east slope at dawn, dropping tags and recording coordinates while frost held his boot prints like signatures. Rachel would meet deputies at the gate, collect casts where tread marks bit deep, and hike to the bench by noon with a camera and forms sealed in plastic. They would sweep each loop twice, once to document, once to erase. Mercy would be thorough, and so would justice. The pup woke and padded to the hearth, cocking a head at the gentle bell of burning sap. Caleb knelt, palmed a rib, and felt strength where fear had lived. He thought of the sheet of names in the drawer, and understood it would remain a memorial, not a... The living had set a different compass in his hands. Come when called, steady what shakes, free what can still run. The cabin had stopped being a bunker and become a chapel made of wood, light and attention. Snow softened midday glare into a mild glow. A raven clucked from the porch roof. From town came the faint cheer of children on sleds, carried upriver by cold air like a blessing from a congregation you cannot see. Caleb kept returning to the small acts that had turned a long night. A knock, a door unlocked, gauze wrapped right, a rope tied neatly, a promise said aloud under weather that tests men. None required a crowd, all demanded willingness. As the sun tilted, he and Rachel hauled the burlap sacks to the shed. Cable clinked with a sound that felt like cords snapping in some hidden place. He marked the date on rough pine. What we took down, what goes no more around bone. They stood a moment without speaking, hearing wind lift and fall across the ridge like the organ of a cold cathedral. That evening the dogs slept by the fire as if they had always known this address. The pup dreamed with small kicks. The mother opened one eye, checked the room, and closed it, trusting the night to humans who had earned the post. Caleb read a field psalm he kept folded in his Bible. Blessed are the merciful, for they shall receive mercy. The words were not a spell, but they taught him how to hold the day. He felt something like a hand on his shoulder, not heavy, not commanding, just steady enough to say keep going. In the days that followed, neighbors waved more often, asked about tracks on fence lines, and offered thermoses to rangers. A rancher swung a gate long stuck and mended wire that had learned the wrong habit. A teacher brought students to the trailhead and showed them where willow tips redden and thaw, how elk leave dew claws where incline steepens, why you never string anything across a path you did not walk kneeling first. Change moved through the valley like a thaw under crust, quiet, faithful, inevitable. When the warrants came, the work felt clean. Rachel led the team into timber with sure steps and a rested face. Deputies packed wire out in big curls. The men who had set the lines learned that the hills had eyes and the law wore boots. There was no triumph, only relief. Harm does not vanish when you lift it. It becomes memory and instruction. They filed the paperwork and then went back to walking, because walking is how you keep a place from forgetting. On a late Sunday, when clouds braided salmon and gold over the bridgers, Caleb built a small shelter by the tray line, a windbreak of poles and spruce boughs, roof pitched just enough, floor laid with shaved cedar. He left it open, a chapel without a door. He hung a single strip of the first snare above the entrance, not as a trophy, as a vow, never again here. The dogs investigated, approved the joinery with sniffs, and settled against his boots while he watched light pour down the valley like fresh water. He had prayed clumsily for years. Now prayer sounded like chores done well, circuits hiked with eyes open, calls returned, coffee shared quietly, with a ranger who did not waste words. He understood sainthood could look like a scar under fur, like a rope burn healed into thicker skin, like a porch light left on for whoever needs it. Kindness had not changed the weather. It had changed the meaning of the weather, which was better. The town noticed and approved. The pup soon matched his mother's pace across the field, not quite graceful, They chased ravens and shadows, returned on their own, and slept by his fire when the moon lifted frost into a glittering choir. They were not pets, they were partners, sacraments with noses. The house felt truer for their breathing, and the ridge felt less like a wall. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs hope. Type Amen in the comments if you believe in second chances. Subscribe for more stories of courage and love.